was going to ask you was the world of music criticism seems to have a real capital problem. How do we keep these places alive? Where does the cash come from to keep circulating?
It really depends because, so at least in the case of, I've worked everywhere from like from a smaller magazine. I was at previously at Paste magazine, going to paper, which people would assume had a larger budget than we did. We had photo shoots and all that stuff. But I don't think people realized how advertising dollars and their power has certainly changed. And I think people don't realize that it doesn't matter how much you go on a website, at the end of the day, the people that used to be willing to shell out big bucks for ads or sponsorships and stuff don't have that money anymore. We're all in a bad spot. Or if they do, they'd rather put that into what seemingly has more of a return now. Whether that be like paying a TikToker. It's easier to pay a TikToker $200 or $2,000 than taking out a $10,000 ad budget. Um, so I think that's definitely a big thing. One thing that I feel like a lot of people know, but one thing that definitely helps a lot, obviously, is if you see a website and you like the website, stay on the page a little bit longer. That's
Mm.
why, for example, at Paper, I did this, or at Paste, we did something similar. We'd insert ads as the piece was going on, or related links,
Yeah.
because what shows up really well in analytics and is good for advertisers to see is page time. And I always explain to people, you see so many articles, they might have 100,000 views in one day, but the retention rate is really, really low, because some of those people, after they read that one thing, they leave, or they read just the first page,
Yeah.
for the first paragraph, and leave, or they just quickly scroll, say, oh, you know what, I don't like it, there's no pictures, maybe, or so they leave.
Mm.
And I say one really valuable thing is actually reading stuff, staying on the page a little bit longer. It depends on the analytics, but some places even count, like, do you actually scroll down the page, not just like leaving it on, because you could just leave an auto clicker, refresh it, and it'll count as a page view. Um, Clicking other links if you see something that's interesting. Um, and then I also think it's really, I've had mixed feelings about this, but as time has gone on, especially thinking about, because LA Times just today announced that they're going to be laying off people too. I don't
Ooh.
know how much of a staff cut, but it's going to be a decent amount. And
Yeah.
one of my friends, Susie Esposito, did a made a tweet about it, saying stop asking me for free articles, because they have a paywall. And for places that do have a paywall, I do have mixed feelings about that whole entire model. And I feel like essential coverage, such as, for example, the New York Times talking about COVID or
Right.
certain very important political stuff, should not be left behind a paywall, even though you can find it somewhere else. But I do think that if people do have the money to be able to support the websites that they love in a certain way, I believe Stereo Gum implemented that policy. And and more places are having Patreons or memberships or Discords. And I think that's really, key. I I don't really know, because obviously, like, the goalposts keep changing, and
Yeah.
the power of advertising and all this stuff is constantly changing. But I think the most important thing too is not even just to support the publications itself, but look at the people who are writing things, and follow them on Twitter, follow them on Instagram, keep up with them, and so that if something happens, you can follow them somewhere else. And obviously, eventually, as people start to see that there's that track record where people are willing to read and listen to somebody's work, they can hopefully have a little bit more stability. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, and it goes back to, I don't know, goes back to what my boss told me when I was working at Kentucky Fried Chicken. He said, uh, every customer that has a bad experience tells 10 people, and everyone that
Yep.
has a good experience tells 5 or less, you know? Uh, but we need to reverse kind of our mind state. Whereas I think at this point, certainly Twitter and a lot of social media operates on, I read this review, it made me mad, this guy's an idiot, right?
Yep.
Person's dumb and I don't like them. Whereas you read an article, a review you do like, you may not even register who wrote it, you know? Uh, Whereas I think everybody needs to do a better job minding the good writing, right? That was a good one. I like Alphonse Pierre. I'm going to follow, I'm going to, do the whole thing, whatever. And so you can have a good working understanding of the area. You can find people's tastes that you understand and that understand what you want. Um, and you could be actively supporting someone who's good at what they do and creative.
Yeah, definitely. And then also going off of that, I feel like we need to also start. I mean, it's on the onus it's on the onus of both the publications and the readers too, because I do feel like that outrage journalism always does better, obviously, especially when it comes to music reviews, and I've seen that more and more, and it really annoys me where people aren't able to look at things from a critical lens and they see something that's bad and automatically think it's an attack on them rather than another way to engage with art,
Right.
and make them like it more or be able to interrogate it more. And then also at the same time, I think a lot of publications need to how understand the behaviors of people, especially when it comes to music, because I think the biggest thing, as somebody who's been covering music and who's worked behind the scenes for a while and who has dealt with the whole dreaded traffic thing, obviously some places like Pitchfork, they'll always do well, because they have a built-in audience that already knows and trusts them. But thinking about, let's say, Forbes, for example. Forbes does well, but
Right.
I don't know if their music coverage necessarily does too hot,
Right.
unless it's like a really big artist, because that's not what the people, their built-in audience necessarily goes for. So that doesn't necessarily mean that these publications shouldn't invest money into that to create that audience and that community. But I also think it also means to manage expectations and stuff. I feel I've had a lot more of I've had a better understanding of how all that stuff works behind the scenes from an analytics point of view, and really being able to see how the perceptions of people, how the perceptions of the publication based on, I cannot talk today, the perceptions of the publication from the audience itself can impact those sorts of things. Even when I was at Pace, even though it started out as an OG music magazine, the biggest issue that we dealt with constantly was how people consume music. You
Right.
can't go every single week, like when you're curled up in bed. You could look up what are the best movies on Netflix now, and you'll be able to find that. And we were always one of the top. But you can't really do that for albums. I feel like the way that people consume music, especially with streaming and how big and crazy and vast it is, and most people are passive listeners, which there's nothing wrong with.
Sure.
And so we would not get nearly as much of that traffic because of it. Most people don't read album reviews. Most people don't read live show reviews. Most people won't look at festival coverage, all that sort of stuff. And most people won't read an interview with a musician unless they're a fan of the musician, or it's a really big thing, or there's some sensational story behind it. And I think a lot of people need to understand that. And sadly, you could love something so much as I have, and also realize that that love isn't always going to be able to sustain you or where you're working, because you're also largely dependent on the powers that be, and oftentimes that's the audience.